Welcome back to the 2022 IRDR Humanitarian Summit. Thank you so much for coming, and I'm delighted to have our panel here on climate change, conflict, and migration with Claudia Santos, who's joining us from Lisbon because she has COVID-19 and didn't want to kill anyone, and then Callum Nicholson and Caroline Voet. What's very useful about this topic is actually the fact that, as we heard this morning, there is so much that we need to know, so much that we need to do. Tomorrow, the United Nations Refugee Agency is going to be releasing its global report on migration, where the numbers are expected to be 100 million people displaced, about half inside their own country, 100 million people displaced for the first time. And the news this morning, if people pick up the news from the UK, a new paper has just been published saying that 200,000 homes are in danger of being ruined and people having to leave because of sea level rise and other coastal changes. So I was quoted in the Times on this. I think I said something intelligent, which also suggests that you might want to know, well, since I'm so famous being quoted in one of the 4 UK broadsheets, who am I? So again, to welcome you, my name is Ilan Kelman. I'm 50% here at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction and 50% at the Institute for Global Health, looking at many issues regarding climate change, conflict, and migration. So I'll be chairing today, and we'll start right away with Claudia. Please go ahead, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Ilan. Can everyone hear me well? Great. And thank you everyone for being on that side. I would like to start off by saying that although I'm going to be talking about Guinea-Bissau, and this might be new to you in terms of its geographical context, what I'm going to say about climate change and migration, about the relationship between the two, is not new at all. And many things have been said this morning about it, and I will just continue also that conversation. Just to give you a little bit of context, I would like to tell you that Guinea-Bissau is a small island developing state in the west coast of Africa. It has an archipelago with 88 islands, 23 of which are inhabited. It has a population of around 2 million people. Over 20 different ethnicities. It is also located just about 100 kilometers far from the Sahel region, and over 80% of its population lives in coastal areas. And so, despite this apparent geographical fragility to an array of extreme weather events and climate phenomena, I have always approached with caution, or I should be more direct and say, I have challenged the idea of climate change as a main driver of migration. And so, at the time I started my PhD 4 years ago, many authors, and way before that, had already given plenty of evidence that, one, climate change was insufficient as an explanation for migration on its own. Number two, that a discourse highlighting climate change as a threat multiplier was in the best interest of Western states to further secure their borders. And number three, that numbers and projections and apocalyptic narratives around climate refugees did them more harm than good, collectivizing them as victims and removing their agency. And so I went into the field, into Guinea-Bissau, wanting to pursue qualitative research and investigate the role climate change was playing in people's livelihoods and how that influenced their migratory decisions. And so I started by questioning state and non-state actors on climate change and development issues ongoing in the country. I interviewed state officials, ministers, local and international NGOs before I got to listen to what communities had to say. And one sentence I would often hear would be, did you know that Guinea-Bissau is the second most vulnerable country to climate change after Bangladesh? And that sentence stayed with me since then, because what does it mean to be vulnerable? What makes people in Guinea-Bissau and elsewhere vulnerable? And who is vulnerable? Is everyone vulnerable or just some of them? And it was not until I began to do my research in the communities that I came to see how this sentence really translated. And so in my conversations with communities, I did not want to induce any climate or environmental degradation in my conversations. People were free to express what concerned them the most in their lives. Yet I wanted to cover different locations with completely different climate phenomena, so from sea level rise to droughts, heavy rains, in different contexts. So I covered rural, urban, islands, and coastal areas. And I wanted to see how these different dynamics would play in their livelihoods, together with the social, economic, cultural, political factors, and how then this would influence their decisions to move or stay put. And things like water scarcity, seawater inundation, and saline intrusion, more erratic and heavy rainfalls, they were all reported across these different locations. People also tend to perceive, almost everyone that I spoke to, perceive a reduction in the rainy season from 6 to 4 months. And I would like to give you a few quotes, because I think it's really important when I do quote people in a way to give them some agency. And I would like to give you some quotes of what people would say when I would ask them, then why do you think that it doesn't rain as before? And you would hear things like, the forests are no longer sacred, and then people would engage in conversations about colonial deforestation, about current practices where the government is issuing licenses for deforestation to foreign companies. People will also mention the dam built in Senegal has been affecting us since the 1980s, referring to the lack of water existing in rivers and water streams. So there has been lack of transboundary water governance between or with the initiative. The government of Guinea-Bissau has not initiated conversations with Senegal in terms of fair shares, and this is affecting populations downstream, and they're very conscious about this. In urban Bissau, people would say, I built my house here 12 years ago, I didn't have any problems with the flooding, now I get flash floods. Yes, urban sprawl is a massive concern in Bissau. There is no governance mechanisms to address urban planning, or if there are, they're highly ineffective. And then you have island populations mentioning about shifts in fish species, and they would say our fish is gone because of the big foreign fleets. So, on top of all of this, people would claim, and this has no particular order. I could have started a conversation and people would immediately say that what concerns them the most is not having health, access to health, not having roads to reach a hospital. So in no particular order, these are all concerns that affect people in Guinea-Bissau: access to education, health treatments. And people are continuously deprived from these basic needs that inevitably impact their ability to cope. What I think is really interesting is that communities do not articulate climate change or environmental degradation as something being out there. They do experience it, they do perceive it, but they articulate this with colonial practices, with pervasive social arrangements, with wrongful conduct and decisions made along the way by those in positions of power. And this has produced over the years an array of injustices for these Guineans, and this also remains as the main causes of their vulnerability. But despite this array of difficulties, huge feelings of marginalization and deprivation, most people at the end of these conversations tell me that they wish to stay put. My question about whether they would have any intention of migrating would be often seen as being almost as utopical. And so I want to tell you why they persist. They persist in place, relying on acts of solidarity and finding collective strategies to actually overcome their day-to-day difficulties. And it's through these acts of solidarity and collective measures they implement themselves that they are able to stay in place. And this is extremely important to me, as it was for Dr. Malik this morning, when he mentioned the importance of highlighting non-migration, as this is the majority of people will not actually be moving from where they are or do not wish to do so far. And so these people go by this way in finding this strategy on their own, because they find they absolutely have no external help for coping with their needs. One thing I want to say about migration, about seasonal migration, this is widely adopted as a survival strategy, as many of you might know, across Africa. This is no different for Guinea-Bissau. Some ethnicities would do it more often than others for cultural reasons. However, this is done for people to be able to cope in the short term. This does not produce fundamental changes in the development of their communities. And this has been studied for Guinea-Bissau. Of course, in the case of migration, you always have young people who wish to live, to study and work elsewhere. Again, this is not new for many other Africans seeking opportunities and improvement of their lives elsewhere. Now, I haven't told you hypothetical stories about the future, as we, the West, tends to imagine. These are stories, as Ilon would say, of the here and now. What I find is that people want to be given conditions to stay in place most of the time, so they don't have to navigate precarity on their own or look elsewhere. And so, for me, the influence of climate change on migration decisions needs to be viewed as a nuanced one. And this has been highlighted by other researchers doing empirical work in other parts of the world. This is not to say that we should not be concerned about climate change. We should. Bissau Guineans have every reason to be concerned about ongoing climate change, environmental degradation, and biodiversity loss happening in their country. And certainly all these will aggravate their livelihoods. However, we need to address what puts and maintains people at risk. For Guinea-Bissau, who endured 11 years of colonial armed conflicts and liberation struggle, and a post-colonial period up until this moment, with plenty of internal conflicts and unrest, these historical and social vulnerabilities are crucial to understand the conditions under which people live, the development and the challenges and the climate challenges they face now, they may face in the future, and any migration outcomes that might come out of it, whether it is to stay or to move. Just one last thing I would like to say. I think we already know enough, and we have produced enough knowledge to help people on the ground. I think we need to shift how we look at these people rather than objects as sole opportunities for data extraction. We need to hear what their needs are, what their proposed solutions are, because many times they have solutions for their problems, recognize their agency, their power, and engage with them with the just policy tools and interventions Dr. Malik was mentioning this morning, and not just focus on the problems. These people have a high capacity to resist. They have been resisting colonial rule and many other things throughout the centuries. And so we should be there to support in every way they need. Thank you.
Obrigado, Claudio, for that powerful rendition and really speaking to some of the points that were demanded this morning about, as Bina said, nothing without us, nothing about us without us. As you mentioned with Dr. Malik, in terms of listening to the people and really trying to determine what do they want, what do they seek, what are they saying. But if you'll let me to take advantage of your COVID fog to challenge you on a couple of points, you're taking the words in your experience from Guinea-Bissau and the words of the Guinea-Bissauans against this idea of climate change as a threat multiplier. But we hear that all the time from the big military people, from the big corporate leaders. So are you saying that the Guinea-Bissauans know more than people managing $1 trillion budget?
No more, sorry? Can you just repeat the end?
So are you saying that the Guinea-Bissauans know more than people managing $1 trillion budget?
Yes, indeed. I have chosen these locations, the location that I've chosen to study, I did so because I knew that there were climate change adaptation programs being implemented on the ground. And I wanted to see also what was the perspective of these Guineans on how effective they were on the implementation, whether or not they have been asked about the implementation of these projects. And yes, people have the answer many times as to how to do it, what should be prioritized in a climate adaptation project. Perhaps it's not a water retention basin for animals to drink water that after 5 years no longer works. If they would have asked people what they needed the most in that community, the answers would have been much more different. And even then, they know exactly why the basin doesn't work, because it evaporates water. It has not been dug enough, deep enough to retain water in that location. So if you ask me if people know the best, they know their reality the best. They know their needs the best, more than anyone else, more than me, who's been there researching. I'm just giving you a glimpse of all that they know. I just know a little bit of what they told me. What about the things they have not told me, the things that I have not asked? So yes, I very much think that high-level people should be working with these people on the ground. It is crucial to address the problems in the best way possible. Sorry.
So how do we get these messages and the words of the Guinea-Bissauans to the generals and to the people promoting the threat multiplier narrative?
Yes, to me, and this raises questions of also about positionality. Am I an activist enough in the work that I do? I think we all need to be activists in the work we do, whether we are academics, whether we are policy makers, etc., etc. We all have, if we have that possibility to influence people in higher hierarchies, then we should be doing so. The way I've been doing and how I position myself, I really do want to be influencing these Guineans to take the leads and do research in their country, to stand up for the government. And they are doing right now, that right now they are on the roads protesting against the fact that the government has not been paying teachers again for another 8 months. They are being beaten up. So I use my PhD as a platform whether it's through social media or the people I talk to or over here, to try and influence the way people think and see these people in the global south. Not as the poor and vulnerable, as we tend to frame them, not as victims, but I really want to shift it and that people start looking at them as people with important power, with persistence, with resistance. In fact, towards the end of my PhD, I realized that I spent too much time, and I still think that's necessary to have this discussion, talking about the reasons why people decide to migrate or stay put. And when I come towards the end of the PhD, I just realized there is an element that I don't see anyone talking about, which is how do these people persist in place? So I wanted to talk about resistance, not resilience, although these can be synonyms. In this case, I wanted to bring this grassroots movement to explain that in the absence of a state, in the presence of the international community, sometimes with good intentions, not always with the best implementation, people have to rely on their own and on their own community and on these acts of solidarity to overcome all these challenges.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
We now move over to Callum Nicholson. Callum.
Okay, hello, can you hear me? Yeah, great. So first of all, thanks Alan for the invitation to come speak here today. So it's great to be in UCL. So I've been asked today to talk about the centrality of causality, or problems around causality in the study of the link between climate and migration, and also to not just talk about the centrality of causal claims, but also the problems with the types of causal claims that we try to make, and what we can do in light of the tension between what we feel we have to do and what indeed we can say about causality on this issue. So first, it's worth noting that the topic of the link between climate change and migration really emerged after the end of the Cold War to be a little bit glib, with the end of political risks, political threats rather, at the end of the Cold War, we became preoccupied with apolitical risks. And among these, of course, were climate and indeed migration. It's only in the 1990s that environmental issues and indeed migration became hot political topics. And of course, in the years since, we've seen not only both of these issues dovetail together, but we've also seen now their association with third topics. So increasingly you'll hear about links between not just climate change and migration, but a presumption of a link between them, and then a discussion or a question about the implications for topics as diverse as global health, human trafficking, conflict, development, and so on. The problem with all this is we don't really know what we're talking about. And I mean this quite literally, not pejoratively. It's not because people haven't thought about it enough. It's actually, there's quite a lot of data, quite a lot of papers on this topic. But the problem is that when you talk about this topic of climate change and migration, it's often quite a normatively oriented discussion about what we ought to do to protect, or indeed if you're, well, one view is to protect climate migrants, the other is to stop climate migration. And of course, these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive positions, though one is more politically left, one is more politically right, but I think they're not that different, actually, in some ways. But the problem is, regardless of what you want to do about so-called climate migration, it all presumes that we know what we mean by climate migration. What's interesting about the topic is that however we approach it, whatever our objective, our goal, in the end, it boils down to quite a simple causal claim. There's a presumption that we can determine exclusively a relationship between something we call climate and something we call migration. And I should say the problem with that is, of course, how you define climate as distinct from other variables, political, social, economic, is challenging. And indeed, how we define migration is inherently quite political. Are you a migrant after you've gone a mile, 100 miles, cross international borders? Do you have to stay a day, a week, a year? Where you draw the line in the sand is inherently quite political. It's not really a scientific question. It's one more of values, culture, subjective consensus. But of course, then, not only do you need to determine the relationship between the independent and so-called dependent variable, climate and migration, you also then from that presume that we can distinguish a so-called climate migrant, or whatever other term you want to use in place of that, from any other type of migrant or indeed person. The problem is that on all these questions, for the reasons I've stated, that it's very, very ambiguous. And if there's one consensus across the literature, it is that there is no consensus across the literature. If there's one conclusion of the literature, is that they really don't have any conclusions. And you see papers now often begin from that premise. In 2019, there was an article co-authored by 31 leading scholars on this topic, published in Nature Climate Change. And their starting point, not their conclusion, their starting point was, we don't really understand causality, and indeed the seeking of a causal claim is, or causal statement on this is almost impossible. And then they were trying to work out what to do instead. But what I think is really interesting, when you look at the literature on this topic, even though people often acknowledge now the problem with causality, they continue to talk about the topic as if they hadn't. And I've noticed very quickly 6 tendencies in the literature in lieu of making a clear statement. The 6 tendencies are, very quickly, to state things that are kind of what I call general statements that are quite banal. To say something like, climate affects migration. You know, in a very general sense, yes, because everything affects everything. But it doesn't really allow you to render it specific in a particular case. The second tendency is almost the antonym of that, which is an arbitrarily specific claim. So someone looks at a village and say the river's moved, people migrated, it must be some sort of environmentally related migration. But of course, there are always political economic conditions. There's been a dam built upstream and so on. So we can't necessarily generalize from that specific case to a general rule. The third tendency is contradiction, where people will say, the causes of migration are complex, and sometimes quite literally in the next sentence they'll say, therefore we need more research to understand the nature of climate migration. But if you've stated the causes of migration are complex, how are you stating ontologically you have this discrete thing called climate migration? The fourth tendency is kind of the opposite of contradiction in a logical sense. Tautology is, and this is tautology. Tautology, just to make it clear what the concept is, logically speaking, is if you say it is raining or it's not, that's a logically true statement because it includes all the possible options. I mean, we're in England, so obviously there's always something in between raining or not, but you get the point. The problem is it's logically true, it's raining or it's not, but it's not helpful to you if you want to decide whether to bring an umbrella. And if you look at the issue around climate migration, often the conclusions that are drawn, if they are actual assertions of some claim, they are often tautological. So in 2011, the UK government sponsored something called the Foresight Report. And if you actually read its executive summary, it's all tautologies. They say there is a continuum of forced to voluntary migration, or some people will move from climate change and some not, and some people will move away from climate hotspots and some towards them, or immobility matters as much as mobility. All these statements that probably are undeniable, but at the same time, they're not particularly helpful, because what are the other options? You would move or not, but again, who is who? But I think underlying all these symptoms, or all this pattern of tendencies, is I see them as quite symptomatic of a deeper problem. And it's less about the data, it's more about the frame of reference we have when we look at issues of the societal impacts of climate change. And of course, the reason we care about climate change is because of certain assumptions about its societal impact. We care because it's of consequence. But it's very interesting if you look at the way that, for instance, the climate migration topic is framed. There's a very classical mechanical framework to it. We all remember from high school Newton's 3 laws of motion, very quickly, that an object will remain in its current state unless acted on by another force. Second is that the amount of change will be proportional to the force applied. And the third is that an equal and opposite reaction always occurs. That's kind of how we think about the societal impacts of climate change, if you think about it. There's a presumption society will more or less stay as it is unless acted on by this external force. There's a presumption that the amount of societal change will be proportional to the amount of climate change. And there's a presumption it will be met by equal and opposite hostility or unwelcomeness. That'll be equally and oppositionally problematic for society, climate change. It seems to be a deeply embedded metaphor in how we think about it. And I'd put it to you that this sort of classical mechanical metaphor has always been inappropriate for understanding migration, not only, I think, in its particulars, but also in its general spirit. The general problem is precisely that it's quite spiritless. It is a dead model that assumes that people, we, are simply terrestrial bodies that we may categorize, model, and predict as we do celestial ones. And it is a monistic framework that assumes people are a unity, that we all share a common outlook, are compelled by the same desires and fears, and in receipt of the same facts, rather than being, as we are, I think, a plurality with endlessly divergent mores, motives, and forms of meaning. As such, it seems to be a metaphor, this classical mechanical metaphor. It seems to be founded not simply on a misunderstanding, but an exclusion of everything that really makes us human: the particular, the subjective, the contradictory, and the uncertain. And in my view, to talk of migration in the context of climate change is always and inescapably to talk from within this classical mechanical metaphor. For any such discussion always implies in the end a concern for causality. Herein, I think, lies the paradox at the heart of the research and literature on this topic. And this is this: the paradox is that to speak coherently on this subject requires us to adopt a classical mechanical metaphor. But to adopt that metaphor is to retreat into an abstract realm that actually bears very little relation to the real world and the lives of real people within it. And for at least a decade, this paradox has been something of an unwelcome elephant in the room, in the corner of any conference room, I should say, where climate migration is discussed. While many researchers seem to recognize its existence, few are really willing to formally and publicly contemplate its full implications. Yet I think this paradox, this need to speak in a classical mechanical way, but also once you do, you're not really talking about the real world, I think it's no less conspicuous for being ignored, and it constitutes, I think, the most profound and pressing issue facing substantive research on this topic, regardless of whether that research is empirical, data-driven, or normative about laws and conventions. And I think also I mentioned before about the 6 tendencies. I actually only got as far as tautology. The final 2, I totally forgot to mention. The 5th one was the laundering of categories, which is interesting because it's gone from environmental refugee to environmental migrant to environmental mobility or climate mobility or environmentally induced migration or environmental migrant to be or migration in the context of climate change. You know, these are the narcissism of small differences. They are distinctions without differences, because they're all, again, implying the same causal claim. And the 6th tendency is what I call can kicking. It's where people say, more research is needed. But they never really answer the question of what precisely or why precisely did the previous research fail. And so if you just say more data is needed, you're not necessarily solving the reason why the old data wasn't good enough. So I missed those 2 out. It's important. Now, the topic over the last decade has laundered its terms a lot. It's gone from, it's now, the main term is climate mobility. That's what's used now. But it's very ambiguous as to what that means, because it also includes immobility in terms of the migrant end, migration end, and at the climate end, actually also, if you read what people are writing, involves political economy in general, which leads you to the question, why privilege climate change as a driver of migration, and indeed, why privilege migration as a consequence of climate change? They've avoided critique by expanding it and becoming so general that you can't falsify anything that's being said. But I think this is really not a problem of data. It's one of aspect of how we see the world. And so what I want to end by suggesting is I think when we look at this topic, we really need to change our mode of thinking, to think less about the importance, to rethink less the importance of climate change or indeed of migration, but rather to rethink the way in which our culture frames the relationship between the two. In a sense, I think we need less an anthropology of climate migrants and more an anthropology of ourselves who think about these issues. And crucially, and this is where I'll end, I think we really need to approach this issue with a little more caution, a little more epistemic humility, and a little more epistemic due diligence as a prerequisite to taking any action, especially if we seek to take actions that we perceive as being moral and want to avoid actions which are arbitrary or, worst of all, can have unintended consequences. Rigor matters. This topic is full of sentiment, and quite understandably. I quite agree that we should be concerned about the consequences of climate change. I quite agree that we should be concerned about the welfare of migrants. But I think ultimately there is a need not just for sort of a normative position of how we think the world ought to be, and not simply an analysis of even how the world is, but we need to be very conscious of our own limits. Ought does not imply can. We need to be conscious of what we can say. And that's a question and a problem less to do with climate change or migration, but about ourselves and our culture and our technocratic institutions and how they try and engage with these issues. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Callum. So tell me, when you so surgically undermine an entire field, what sort of reaction do you get?
Well, it's very interesting because it's very interesting with the climate debate because it's quite political in a sense. It's not political, it's quite religious because you really have two positions on it. You have the so-called believer position and the so-called denier position. So you have the faithful and you have the atheists. And as everyone knows, atheists are very religious because they are defined by negation. They're not religious, right? And that's quite religious. It's quite a position based on belief to me. I've always thought there's a need for a third position, which is not invested in either. And what I find is I tend to piss off everyone because because the people who are the climate activists don't like what I'm saying because I'm not beginning from a normative position. But the climate deniers don't like what I'm saying because I'm not denying climate change. And I just think we all need to cultivate a little more dispassion, a little more analytical rigor. And not because climate doesn't matter, but precisely because it does. Precisely because it does. Because in the end of the day, if we're not rigorous, then we're open to the accusation that we're crying wolf. And sentiment doesn't also, it's not simply that either, it's not simply perception. In reality, if we want to fix problems, we need to be rigorous about what the problem is. We spend so much time looking at solutions without necessarily knowing precisely the nature of the problem. We know there are problems, we all agree on that, but there's a huge difference between knowing there are problems and knowing the nature of the problem. You know when you are sick, but you need someone to diagnose the illness in order to treat it. And I think we all spend a lot of time just saying, we're sick, we're sick, we're sick, in the context of climate. But I think in order to understand the nature of the illness, we need to be not just conscious of the nature of climate change or indeed migration, but again, the nature of ourselves and our own culture, and not simply its imperatives of what must be done, but also the limits on what we can do. But to answer your question briefly, that the reception I get is I think, understandably, sometimes a little bit hostile. And I think that's but I think the onus has always been on me to become more clear. And I'm still working on that. But I hope it's at least a position which is stimulating and provocative, not in a political sense, but provoking thought, which is the point.
So being more rigorous, being less abstract, giving definitions, how does that help the people?
Well, I mean, this is kind of that's exactly the right question in a sense, because often the reaction that I find my position receives, I remember once I was at a conference and someone said, it's really good to have talked about these philosophical questions, but we really need to get back to the data.
Wasn't that me?
It might have been you. It might well have been, actually, come to think of it. But it was. But the truth is, at the end of the day, what is the data about? We say we want to help the people, but helping people is not a performative action. It should be a substantive one. So if we want to say, oh, we want to help, that's great. But if you actually want to help, you need to first work out, not just state that you want to find a solution, which makes us all feel good and certainly look good. We want to work out what the problem is. So I don't think this idea of rigor and reflecting on our frames of reference when they've repeatedly failed to find clear definitions and so on, I don't think that's a separate or indulgent exercise. It's essential to the process of being ethical. Because ethical is also about being precise and about being kind of humble, not to be hubristic about what we believe we can know, when in fact there are limitations on that. So I think that would be my response.
Okay, thank you so much again.
Pleasure, thank you.
Now over to Caroline Voet, and I'll just bring up your slides.
It's quite something to follow. Thanks for that, Callum.
Pleasure.
Yes, so thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here today, and particularly thank you to Professor Callum. I admit that on many occasions we have taken advantage of his good graces to ask for advice as we've waded into the area of the intertext between humanitarian aid, health, and migration, and climate change, and so it's happy to do our best to return the favor. I'm going to do my best to speak from the perspective of kind of health and humanitarian practitioners, which is what my organization does, so Médecins Sans Frontières. I think we've spent enough time this morning going over the different definitions, but I did want to take, next slide, please. I did want to take a moment to give a bit of context to at least the discussions that we've been having inside my organization around displacement, migration, and then the intersects with climate change. So for anyone who knows MSF, you'll know that working with and responding to the needs of people who are forced from their home, either temporarily or permanently, on the move, or arbitrarily detained or trapped en route, as has also been described this morning. It's been a key part of our work since the organization started, and it's been accelerating in line with needs. Migration for us remains a really urgent topic because it has a huge bearing on people's health and well-being. It's jeopardized frequently at the moment of exodus or flight, as well as at the moment upon arrival, and so that's why we really pay attention. Oops. Can everyone hear me? Oh, that's better. So there are many reasons for migration and many different types of displacement and migration, as we've heard this morning. So yes, climate, but also war, persecution, disaster, destitution, political repression. And as an organization, we really struggle to separate out the causes, and at a certain point, it's not necessarily advantageous for us to spend time doing that. And so while we work to respond to needs as we see them, we really struggle to identify where the intersects are and how they would actually change the way we operate. In some cases, we have found elements that do change. If we identify that there's an indirect or direct driver from climate, then we can see that there's an element to change. But in some respects, if you have a flood response, you're still going to respond to the immediate needs of the human in front of you. You're not responding to the flood. So one of the things that really strikes us is similar to what Claudia said, is that when we speak to people about the impacts of climate change, people don't describe themselves as displaced by climate change. They don't describe themselves, as contentious as the term may be, as climate refugees. Displacement and migration resulting from severe weather events is obviously very visible, but people can also move as a result of slow onset issues. They can move because they're forced from their homes by lack of livelihoods, or by a loss of well-being where they were originally at. So either way, for MSF, we can see that we're already working in a lot of the most climate vulnerable places, and we're already working with a lot of the most climate vulnerable populations, and we can already see that they're being exposed to the impacts that we're told that they're going to be exposed to, and we can see that they are accelerating. So at least this reality, based on observation alone, we see it. Next slide, please. I think what's most useful here is just to tell you some of the types of different displacement that might be linked to climate change that we see. On the slide here, so the first type would be, sudden onset extreme weather events that are influenced by climate change. Most often these cause displacement where entire communities are shifted or they're forced to evacuate, generally for a temporary period, but also increasingly on a more permanent basis. And so actually on the slide here are some photos from a colleague of mine who returned from South Sudan in April, and this is a photo of Bentiu IDP camp, which is walled off to prevent the flood waters getting in. So I want to speak about South Sudan. South Sudan, the frequency of floods and droughts have increased over the last eight decades, with the last 3 years that bring massive flooding and displacement in several states. People have had their lives devastated, they've had their homes gone, possessions, livestock, livelihoods, you name it. We hear, that South Sudan is ranked number 5 in terms of most vulnerable country to climate change, but we have to consider the aspect that is particularly because it has ongoing conflict and insecurity, which affects the country's ability to respond to the need to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. Its institutions just can't do that when it's also faced with a myriad other issues. However, what's most important in the circumstance of South Sudan is that there is an increasingly short period of time between these events. So particularly in terms of the floods, it's really very few months in between each one, and people don't get time to recover from one flood event to the other. In fact, many parts of South Sudan, we're seeing now that floodwaters are simply not receding before the next round of flooding arrives. They don't have time to dry out. So people who might have returned home are actually being turned into more of a permanent IDP situation. So one of the things we really need to recognize is we speak about the impacts as kind of maybe not one-off events, but this is really very frequent, one after the other, one on top of the other. So for the case of South Sudan, we've really realized that extreme weather events are just the reality of the future, and we cannot approach them by responding just to one flood event. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk about the different types of kind of slow onset crises that we see that also generate displacement. Some of our colleagues that were speaking here earlier from Bangladesh, I wanted to speak about one of the projects that we run in Kamrangichar, which is in a slum area of Bangladesh's capital in Dhaka. So in circumstances like this, or in some slow onset crises, we see that that displacement is usually influenced by a combination of factors that drive people to stay within their own country, and they seek refuge often in sometimes overpopulated urban areas. In Kamrangichar, the people that we see are largely migrants from rural areas, and for many of them, the decision to migrate was largely due to a loss of or insufficient return from their livelihoods. When people move into these urban areas, the urban areas are not prepared to receive people. Individuals end up working in jobs that expose them, such as in small factory work. They're exposed to injury, illness, poor protection, dangerous machinery, and on top of it all have generally a poor access to health care and are forced into informal living conditions. So people who end up internally displaced and into urban environments tend not to be followed, as mentioned earlier this morning, by data tracking, et cetera, but in fact end up suffering quite several levels of suffering, essentially. So facing compounded threats to their health and well-being, but they end up being invisible in the grand scheme of things. Another element that we see is that you have slow onset crises that generate mass displacement. These tend to be intensified droughts. They're linked to water scarcity, and this negatively affects water quality. It affects crop yields, food security, and disease. Sometimes the combination of these is prolonged conflict and insecurity. It tends to force hundreds, thousands, millions of people to flee. They seek refuge in camps or in urban areas in order to attain some degree of assistance. So in this respect, I want to talk about Somalia actually right now. It's facing one of the worst droughts you've seen in 40 years after back-to-back rainy seasons, poor rainy seasons, and still hasn't recovered from the 2017 drought. People are faced with recurrent flare-ups of violence, fighting. They've been forced to flee their homes in order to seek food, water, and pasture for whatever remaining livestock they have. In these areas, we're seeing an intensifying health crisis. Malnutrition is on the rise, and on top of it all, Somalia is facing a fast-spreading measles outbreak. Hundreds of thousands of people are escaping rural areas and into urban centers right now, where their public services are stretched. Cholera has already started to spread, and people have exhausted their ability to cope and recover between crises. So the repeat exposure to extreme events such as these reflects a deterioration for us of the humanitarian situation. Yet, we are responding to health needs but not to this displacement, and we're facing funding shortfalls that mean humanitarians are unable to meet the needs of the growing number of people in this situation. Chronic conflict prevents a robust government response again, and the world, we heard a lot this morning about loss and damage negotiations. There's still no other mechanism to try and deal with this. Oh, there's a third, do I have 1 minute extra? There's one instance that I haven't put up here actually is there's another type of slow onset displacement, which is essentially the situation that I described similar to Bangladesh, but if you add in environmental degradation. So you see this a lot in South America, or we are seeing it a lot in South America, for instance, in projects in Honduras and Guatemala, where people are faced with the issues that they face in terms of economic drivers, social drivers, but also potentially climatic drivers that force them from their homes and make them move. But on top of that, you have issues of environmental degradation. where you've got large corporations that have set up deals with governments in terms of mass farming, logging, mining, leading to issues of land rights and impact on people's livelihoods that force them from their homes. So there, you see this a lot in kind of dry corridor areas along Southern America. So to wrap this up, last slide, please. Thank you. I think one of the discussions we're having in MSF is, are we asking the right questions and are we having the right conversation? For us, it's very clear, and you also see it from the data, but we see it from what, what we see on the ground is that a large proportion of people are internally displaced. So should we not be focusing a lot more in our conversation around this, around the lack of global response to the experiences and needs of internally displaced people, regardless of the driver? Then you can have also the element of climate as part of that. The second is, should we not be challenging the lens through which we're viewing displacement, very much based on who's framing the conversation? The distress of people internally displaced directly and indirectly by, climate change is really overshadowed by this focus on refugees and on international migrants. This is largely linked to international political efforts who are looking at strengthening borders and preventing migration, controlling migration with policies that we see all over the world becoming more and more harmful, UK. And we're paying less attention we're paying a lot of attention to the borders, but not as much attention to what happens behind them and the needs of the people behind them. And I'm actually going to quote quickly some colleagues from the Global Strategic Communications Council, because I can't say that MSF is directly working on it, but we need to pay attention to this, is that, there's a lot to gain from these systems of control of flow of migration internationally. And there are corporations out there, there are individuals, private interests out there that are monetizing on this in terms of weapons, helping to build, physical or theoretical walls, AI, et cetera. And at a certain point in time, maybe the conversation needs to be reversed to ask about their responsibility in this system. Now, that's not something MSF is particularly working on right now, but I think it's worth considering in terms of the narrative we use to see this. And I think the last question that we have, and I don't really have an answer, sorry again, but is considering that the reality of most people in the places that we work is to be faced with so many different levels of threats to their health and well-being, to be losing their ability to resist to these threats and become more and more vulnerable. Shouldn't we be framing interventions in the way we assist based on vulnerability rather than in silos based on specific events? Over.
Merci beaucoup, Caroline. That was very powerful and good to know what's happening on the ground, particularly an IDP camp in South Sudan, internally displaced people. They're already displaced, they get flooded, they get displaced again, and then get displaced again. Are they ever non-displaced?
Is the question that at a certain point they should be considered settled and not be assisted, or?
What do we do about it?
I mean, I think it brings us back to what do we do about it? If people are displaced and it is not their choice, then there's a need to be met there. At a certain point, I think it comes back to the issue of where we're focusing our efforts. And I'm not saying that international migration is not equally important, but we need to pay attention to the issues that are faced by people who are displaced internally, be that multiple displacements, because actually, I mean, the experiences show that people get displaced multiple times. It's just part of the reality. And it's not, displacement with time to settle and reestablish yourself in between and then move again, which would be bad enough. It's you're displaced into a situation that is not set up to accommodate you or your needs. You do your best to survive in this environment, and then you get hit again by something else that keeps moving you. So at a certain point, there's a great ethical unfairness of this, because we're not giving people time to set up in between, and so we haven't set up a system that allows to support that or prevent.
And same with Somalia. So you said it's a very bad drought, the worst in 40 years, so this sounds like it recurs. Measles outbreak, that could be solved with vaccination, not that anyone ever questions the efficacy of vaccinations. And of course, there's issues of governance and conflict, religious persecution and persecution by religion. We don't mention climate change.
In Somalia?
In Somalia.
I mean, I think we do, but very much in the way that I think Callum has described, which is to say that we know that it's impacting, and we know that it is likely a driver, diffuse, direct, indirect, but we haven't figured out where the intersect is that changes the action. And now at a certain point, at least for organizations that fall within the humanitarian sphere, it doesn't change necessarily the activity you're going to roll out on the ground, or does it? So one of the questions that we have right now is you have to take a holistic view of the need of the person, and that will include their experience with the impacts of climate change, whether they name it as such or not. And that maybe requires a different way of approaching the needs of people, and thereby the needs of affected populations. Rather than responding to the issue, you respond to the person and their needs.
Okay, thank you so much again. So Claudio and Callum, you've now heard the humanitarian perspective. You've heard the issues which have to be dealt with actually in these examples. What advice do you have for Médecins Sans Frontières? Claudia?
To us?
Yeah, I'll go with Claudia and then Callum. Yeah.
Sorry, say the question again.
So you've heard the challenges which humanitarians face in reality with these two examples and more. What advice, then, given your research, what advice do you have for humanitarians? Claudia.
Yes, I'll always go back to the same point, which is, what do people really need? Are you talking to people on the ground really and addressing their needs? One of the things I actually wanted to say has to do with how we look at displacement, and this is recent scholarship calling for to decentralize displacement, meaning that displacement is just not about protecting, managing, and relocating people. It's not just about looking at the causes of displacement. It's also about how people experience and suffer with the effects of displacement beyond the perspective of victimhood. When you do this humanitarian work, how much do you take into account of the agency and the transformative power that people actually have to help either the actions that you are performing on the ground, or to get the inputs from them? I mean, this has been a problem, the problem with implementation, and this is very visible in Guinea-Bissau, has been largely communities feel that they are being left out most of the time. But I also know that this is very difficult to be done with under the circumstances that we have in Guinea-Bissau, of a state that malfunctions, and this is the real word. For example, education is one of the sectors that receives the most money in the country, yet people are right now protesting on the roads, and there hasn't been any progress in the education sector in the country for so much time, because the government is not willing to effectively address policy. So yes, I think there are different dimensions here to how a development should conduct itself. We have been hearing calls for a change in the practice for too long, and we also hear that from scholars that perhaps what we're doing with climate change adaptation is just a new form of development. So obviously I'm not a specialist in development, but And then my concern is always the people that we are trying to protect.
Callum?
I think there's one admonition, I think, for people working in policy relevant or advocacy roles and humanitarian roles is to just be careful about the danger of begging the question. One of the issues is begging the question is often now understood as a phrase that means to ask a question, but its actual meaning is to presume the conclusion in the premise of an argument. And it's a danger, it's a logical fallacy I think we all tend to fall into quite easily around these topics. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. It's entirely a valid question in research to say, what are the effects of what are the societal effects of climate change? Because you're not loading it saying it has an effect or not, or which effect it has. And then you can go and work out freely what are the effects based on what you can induce from the data you find. It's also valid to say, what are the causes of migration? Because migration does have causes, it's worth looking at them. But to say we need to know the causes of climate migration or to just say we're going to go research climate migration is begging the question, because you're presuming there is a distinct thing called climate migration in the question. That is the thing to be discovered. But when we state we need more research on climate migration, in a sense, we're already stating our conclusion in the premise that there is a distinct thing called climate migration. And that's where a lot of the problems come from, is a lot of research on this topic is people saying, we need to go study climate migration. No, 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 no. You need to go study the effects of climate change or the causes of migration. If you say we're doing both at the same time as the premise, that's not a good research question. And it's not a good basis and a bad research question and research that chases its own tail as a consequence is no foundation for advocacy that actually represents anyone, or policy that actually helps anyone. So I think the admonition for policymakers, for humanitarians, for advocates, is just to be very careful not to front load or presume in the questions. Again, this sort of epistemic humility, we need to be a bit more humble about what we can know.
So Caroline, does this advice from Claudia and Callum help you, or do you need something more from us?
I think I'll start with Claudia. So, I mean, I think what Claudia said is one of the well-known issues in the humanitarian sector, and one that there have been many commitments to address that I wouldn't assume have never worked, because there is definite improvements. There's definite, I know quite a few instances where there have been community-led explos, et cetera, where the community has defined for itself what is the intervention that's needed. It unfortunately does have to be balanced with the time of an emergency, which doesn't justify sweeping people's needs out of the way, nor their perspectives. And I can't speak for other agencies, but at least for organizations like MSF, the majority of the staff working in our hospitals are usually from the populations that we're working in. So we get a little bit of an advantage there, because we're guided anyway by the people working in the hospitals that we support. But yes, and actually in line with what you said, I do encourage everybody to look up, there's an organization called Health in Harmony that has been working hard on developing a new way of addressing this, which they call radical listening, and they've got quite an interesting series of work that's going on around the role of indigenous populations, around biodiversity loss, and the impact on the spread of disease. So it's interesting to look them up. With regards to your remark, I mean, it's true. All of it is true. At the same time, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're not academics, we're practitioners. And that means we respond to the issue in front of us, and at a certain point, yes, it matters what the driver is, but sometimes it doesn't. You have to deal with the individual in front of you. That said, some of these issues of finding the links, we've decided are not part of our role. We have a particular expertise to bring to the table, and that is of medical and humanitarian practitioners, and that we'll stick to. But we have, I mean, the situation as it stands in the world now has made us realize that partnerships are much more important than we ever thought they were before. And through partnerships with individuals who work on issues such as yourself, such as Ian Kelman, such as the individuals who were here earlier today, we do get that link with the centers of expertise that get to do that work and focus on the research and focus on the data that then assists us in making decisions as we practice. So you have to find a balance. Yeah.
Please. Yep.
Actually, from what you've described, what you guys are doing is precisely the right approach, because you're starting from what is found on the ground rather than, you know, you're inducing what actions you need to take from what you find rather than imposing an abstract framework, which I think is precisely, so I thought what you were saying actually gave me the idea for my last comment, because what you described is that you're precisely not, in a sense, begging the question, which is really, is great to hear that there are organizations that have, you know, in a sense, the humility to pay attention to what they find, rather than to come with their preconceptions.
But it's definitely an issue, sorry.
Yeah.
It's definitely an issue because, you know, it's essentially quite far out of the frame of reference of what we deal with every day. What I would say, I'd remark this from my personal experiences, humanitarian agencies or agencies that work in kind of emergency response bordering on development, they also see this and they know, okay, I'm faced with this issue and you know, experts are telling me that it's connected to climate change, so I'm going to throw this into my flash appeal. I'm going to throw this into my narrative. I haven't really anchored it in the way I adapt my operations, but I have to talk about it. And there's a lot of pressure for humanitarian organizations to do that as well. And you can't, you know, it's really important to find a way to address the issue, but also, you know, remain focused on what the need is at hand, which is as presented to you as coming through your hospital doors or your camp, you know, entrance or whatever it is.
Claudia, any response?
Yes, I'm very happy with what I just heard because if you focus on the actions then to act rather than assuming, as Callum said, that for me is also the way that the practice, the humanitarian practice should be conducting itself. So yeah, I'm very happy to hear.
Not everybody's doing that, though.
Can I just throw
Yep.
kind of one comment? It's interesting, your comments there, though, about the pressures around in advocacy and humanitarian work, the pressures to use the terminology, even if it's not particularly anchored. And that's another thing I think we all need to be quite cautious of, because, of course, climate is an important issue, but there is an expectation now that whatever you're doing in any field, you need to constantly be associating yourself with these themes. And there's a danger sometimes that they obfuscate as much as they clarify. We need to be careful about that. One organization I think is doing very good work on this, actually, Earth Refuge, at least one representative over here. So I met their team a couple months ago, and they've precisely got, from what I understand, the right approach, because they're looking at climate migration issues, but not looking at it from an abstracted point of view. They're trying to look at just what are people actually experiencing on the ground, and how can we help them with local legal solutions given the specifics of their context. And that's precisely the right sort of approach, because it's not starting from some grand abstraction. There's a general context within the context of climate change, but from speaking to you guys, you're not imposing that upon them. You're saying, let's go to climate hotspots and see what is the local situation as it's found. And what you were doing sounds similar, which is the right approach. But there is this danger, of course, in all forms of advocacy, to perform all the current rhetoric in order to get funding, for instance. And I think we need to be careful about the dangers of that.
Right, this is so important, and the P word that Caroline used, partnerships, is what we're looking for. So with Bias and Bina here, Refuge, Médecins Sans Frontières, obviously Callum and Claudia's academics, please do come and join us, become partners, and we can push forward this agenda, create it together for the people. Speaking of people, we have an audience. So are there any questions on Twitter or anyone in the audience who would like to ask? We have one, so it'll just take about 10 seconds for the mic to kick in. So please. And if there's any on Twitter, Stuart, just let us, or Miles, just let us know.
Hi, I'm Rosanna Himaz, and I'm from the IRDR. Thank you so much for the panel members for such stimulating talks, and to Ilan, of course. Many of you touched on this point, or many of you brought this point up, that it is really important to engage with the local communities and sort of develop bottom-up solutions, find out what they want. But then we do know of rigorous, I quite agree with your point about rigor. I cannot agree more about rigor when it comes to causality and attributing causality. We do have, in the context of international development, for example, evidence to say that aid is almost irrelevant and ineffective when it comes to solving some of the problems that it seeks to solve. Now, part of the reason could be because they're not addressing the issues that people actually want addressed. But in a recent book published by Stefan Durkon, who was the chief economist, ex-chief economist of the DFID, what he espouses is that aid and assistance is effective only when the local wealthy elite are actually supporting such endeavors. Now, this is in the context of international development. So you need, it's not, we're not just talking of political power here. We're not talking of governments, we're not talking of donors, it's the local elite, and they have to be involved. Has this sort of idea, do you notice this in humanitarian work as well? Do you need local elite to be involved for your work to be extra effective or effective?
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Please, right behind, and then we'll go one to the back and then come back to the panel.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I have two interlinked questions for Caroline. One is... Oh, is this audible?
That's better.
Great,
and
thanks.
Please introduce yourself.
Sorry, I'm Sam Huckstep from the Centre for Global Development. So I have two interlinked questions for Caroline. One is more operational and one is slightly more theoretical. So firstly, I loved your point at the end. Should we be responding to disasters or should we be responding to vulnerability? And it strikes me, in the light of what Callum was saying also, that just as we have a difficulty in determining who is a climate migrant, we also have a difficulty in determining who is vulnerable and comparing that vulnerability across contexts. We've talked earlier about tipping points, but only from a climate perspective. We have tipping points also from a socioeconomic perspective. In terms of responding in advance to vulnerabilities to climate change, how do we determine who is more vulnerable than somebody else, especially when we're discussing this across different cultures, different contexts, different socioeconomic levels? And secondly, we've talked quite a lot about the impact of climate change in displacing people. But could you talk a bit more about the impact of climate change upon people who are already displaced? What impact might climate change have upon, for example, the industries within which refugees are working? What impact might agricultural shifts have upon local food security for those who rely upon the WFP, for example? Thanks very much.
No, excellent questions. Thank you. I think all three can respond to it. And final question, Lisa at the back. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yes, and then
no problem. Thanks for the amazing talk. My question almost feels stupid because I'm an incoming master's student and I'm so impressed with the amazing talk you've given. My question is for Callum, and my question is, what is the threshold for something to move from abstract to distinct for research? So you talked a lot about sort of climate migration being abstract and not necessarily applicable because you need to act. That's front loading the question. And then you pulled it back and talked about, well, what are the impacts of climate change and what are the impacts of migration? Now, to me, that sort of screams, well, you've given a distinct, well, climate change is distinct and migration is distinct, and they're accepted, but climate migration is not. So I was wondering, what is that sort of threshold? What is the sort of accepted threshold for it moving from abstract to distinct?
And please introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, I'm Callum, and I'm an incoming master's student at IRDR.
Even though Callum...
One L or two?
Two.
Oh, that's not a proper Callum.
So final question, please.
Hi, can you hear me? So my name's Lisa Danker and I'm a lecturer in global health at IRDR. So mine's quite a broad question. A common theme throughout the talks today is the need to have a common framework and consensus on key areas and improve rigour with respect to knowledge gaps, causality, definitions, methodological techniques, etc. So my question is a broad question. What role can the academic community play in generating this, and how do we move forward towards the adoption of a common framework?
Okay, thanks so much. So who would like to go first? Okay,
I'm happy to. The first two questions and the last one, I think there's kind of a theme running through them, which is, and indeed, actually, this is to some extent, actually running through all four questions, is kind of, you boil them all down, I think the genetics of all four is quite a profound but quite simple question, which is, how do you reconcile the macro and the micro? How do we reconcile a concern for effectiveness and also efficiency? If you think about it at a global level, we're interested in sort of general frameworks, which are also efficient, both resource-wise, but efficient in terms of applicable across a range of cases. But the reality is that the real world also exists at a very particular, not general level. And also it's about effectiveness on the ground, not efficiency in general. And I think if you look at the social sciences in general, there's always this tension running through it. And not just social sciences, any sort of action, policy making, there's always a tension between sort of a macro level framework and its efficiency and the effectiveness of a particular intervention. And because if you want to have an effective intervention, if you have infinite resources, sure, you could probably achieve it maybe, but of course we don't have infinite resources. The question we're all faced with is, how do we take our finite resources in the face of infinite problems and apply them efficiently and effectively? That is the essence of all social science, is the essence of all applied philosophy. It's the essence of everything we're doing in all these topics. It could be development, it could be migration policy, it could be climate policy. But I think at the fundamental root of a lot of that is precisely what Callum Nicholson mentioned, which is the question of thresholds. We spend far too much time talking about data and definitions. What we spend far too little time talking about is less about what is the case or what ought to be, but what is the threshold by which we can talk about either. We don't talk about, the questions of thresholds is not a question really of the world, it's about ourselves who are interested in the world. Because if you think about thresholds, then it implies the question, who's asking and why? What are they trying to achieve? What would be a threshold for an effective action or an effective claim? What is your standard? And I think this is what, the reason I got interested in this topic was my first ever conference I went to years ago. People were talking about it and they didn't really, they admitted they didn't know what they were talking about in a sense. And again, not pejoratively, but they genuinely said, we don't know what this topic is. And I thought, well, clearly the prerequisite question is, what would be a threshold for a meaningful claim? Because if you don't know what your threshold would be in principle, how in practice do you know if you found it? And that reflexive concern is often dismissed as sort of philosophizing and not helpful. But I think as Callum's point makes out, it's crucial. It's a question in practice of thresholds. It's not philosophy, it's thresholds. And I think if we're looking at trying to reconcile macro-level perspectives, efficiency, general theory, with specific actions on the ground that are effective, not just efficient, it's really a question of what would be a threshold for a claim that does both. And it's not a question about development or climate or migration per se. It's about how we as a culture think in the world, in modern technocratic societies. And it's a much more sort of profound question in a sense, while also being a very simple question. That the real challenge in all these things is not really the data, the definitions, it's about our frame of reference. I think Callum's quite right on that. So I'd say to you, I don't have an answer for you, but that's the right question.
Claudia, Caroline?
Maybe I'll just pick on that to mention a great paper just came out recently by Ayesha Siddiqui that really touches on this point mentioned by Callum, where she questions that we've spent too much time proving or disproving the relationship. She talks about climate and conflict, but I could apply the same for climate migration. And one thing that she says is that this is the product of imperial knowledge produced by the global north and trying to impose it in the global south. So for me, this is also this self-reflection that Callum is inviting us to have here is really important to me as an academic. This looking at the self and how we become conscious of our limits and the limits of our institutions and what we're researching, what is it for, yeah, what is it for and for whom? Are we doing this on behalf of whom? One thing I would like to pick up was the first question about that I can't remember the name of the person that asked the question, but she mentioned about AIDS as irrelevant, ineffective, and whether only through the local elites would it be possible for this to eventually be effective. So what I never thought about this. I did think about this in terms of the state, but the person in the audience said that this author rules out the state as being the local elite. But to me, when I think about the local elite in Guinea-Bissau, and I'm not sure this applies elsewhere, is these people are not apolitical. They are very, very, very well linked to the political party in power or to the one previously in power. And so, to me, the assistance needs to go through not only to the local elites. I can't see this distinction being made in Guinea-Bissau between local elites and the local power. But the assistance and the way we do things need to go through different levels of power. And in Guinea-Bissau, we go from having local power, people inside the communities which are chiefs, which are religious leaders, and people in the region also responsible for at the regional level, and then people inside the states. And this has been a long-term objective of Amilcar Cabral, which has never materialized for Guinea-Bissau, is having all these people being represented within the state, all the different powers, all the different ethnicities, and that their needs would then be heard through this different powers at the state level. So for me, yes, the AIDS is, I think, it depends very much on the structure of the state, how it's structured, how it's available to take aid and for Guinea-Bissau, I would say not in a corrupted way, which often happens, but thinking about how to utilize this better for the people and how to change policy for everyone. So, yes.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think Claudia has summarized that question quite well. I could go on for many, many hours about this, but the very short answer to your question is absolutely. We need local elite to be involved. Essentially, any individual is linked to a household, is linked to a neighborhood, is linked to a community, is linked to a town, etc. And each of those, geographic regions, no matter how big or small, have stakeholders. And those stakeholders, whether they mean to or not, control access and control what you can and cannot do through different forms, be they rather rigid through governance or through armed actors, or it could just be social influence. So it's absolutely impossible to work anywhere without having discourse and being on board and having active communication channels with local elite. So just to say yes. If you try, it goes horribly wrong. And I'm sure he speaks about that in his book as well. So maybe I should just jump into the other questions that were asked. About the kind of disasters versus vulnerability, and you mentioned a little bit determining vulnerability to act in advance. It's a question, I'm going to give you a little bit of a brain download because it's a question we're asking for ourselves. At least in the humanitarian development community, there is always a promise to do better next time and to act in advance. There are many tools that are designed. We go back to, NASA for better weather data, whatever it is that we do. the reality is, you can see from some of the slides that I showed, it just doesn't work out, which doesn't mean we shouldn't do that. But at the same time, at least for within my organization, one of the things we've been thinking of is how do we just reframe the fundamental choices we make to set up a project. And so it's not so much, there is an element of anticipating in advance, and there will always be response to immediate events or issues. But then there's also the project that you set up based on a perceived need. And so the question is, how do you then reframe the way you perceive that need? And we've tried to restructure it a little bit more along, indicators of social exclusion. Essentially, I don't want to say micro traumas, but small things that in the life of an individual or a community build up over time to say that at a certain point, even though you are not this individual that's been hit by a massive flood and has an unsustainable, life in this circumstance, you are equally so if you are displaced within your own country, living in a city, you've kind of found a way forward, but you're being buffeted from all sides, from all the different circumstances that face you, and your life is equally unsustainable. So we want to give equal weight to that, and it's about reframing your intervention foundations. So a little bit, I don't want to say you shouldn't anticipate in advance, you always should, but let's also plan in advance for that not to work out and frame and put that into your intervention logic as well. In terms of the internal, I'm just checking I remember the question, in terms of the internal displacement and the impacts of people who are stuck, what they face, was that the question? Just checking, yep. I think some of the speakers on the previous panel articulated a few of those, for instance, speaking to the question of non-migration. I think it's back to kind of how you assess vulnerability. It comes back to the other question you had about operations, is that people face a wide variety of issues that make their life possible or not possible, and everybody has their own individual coping mechanisms. And so as those coping mechanisms resist or don't resist, you move, one way or the other on the spectrum of whether you can, be in good health, have a good sense of well-being, have sufficient mental health, etc. And so when we talk about the fact that data monitoring and countries don't declare, etc., particularly for people who are internally displaced, there's a real issue to that, because we really haven't addressed the needs of people who are falling outside of the traditional ways of responding. And so, it's one of the reasons that we're really considering this as for us a big operational gap, a big blind spot.
Thank you so much for the wonderful panel to Claudia, Callum, and Caroline. And in a sense, it really comes down to what we heard from the beginning from Bias, right through to the end, to these final answers. The 3 Ps. Number 1, power. And we know that we have some power, we have some privilege, perhaps not as much as many others, but we can do as much as we can with it in order to identify the questions and then hopefully come up with some answers. Particularly together, because togetherness brings power, which is the 2nd P, that of Caroline's word, partnerships, which again is why we welcome all of you online, in this room, looking at this on YouTube later, to join us. Again, the initiative which was launched today with thanks to Bias and Bina, the 2 Bs, in order to move forward with partnerships and together. Because in the end, it's not really about us. We can be all prominent sitting at the table having our wonderful microphones, but it's not about us. It's about what every single panelist this morning mentioned, as well as Atle in the keynote, the 3rd P of people. And we must never forget the people. Again, as Bina raised from many other fields to bring into migration and migrants, nothing about us without us. We are all migrants to some degree. We all have some level of power. We all seek partnerships. We are all people. And that is the purpose of this new initiative coming from the UCL Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, to which we owe a great deal of thanks to the two who've launched it, Bias and Bina. First, of course, thanks so much to our wonderful microphone handlers at the side here. To Sarah Jill and our support outside, as well as Miles Harris. And the IT and tech support at the front and also at the back doing the video streaming. So ultimately, final round of applause goes not to just, again, Bias and Bina, but to all of you for being part of this. So thank you for the 2022 IRDR Humanitarian Summit, to Peter Sammons for founding the Humanitarian Institute and the summit. And we will all thank you by joining us in South Cloisters for the reception. Thank you again.